Summit 2021, and we're really glad to have with us virtually Guntram Wolff, the director of Bruegel Institute, one of the most important think tanks globally, and considered in the past years to be the European think tank that can actually stand up to the American ones and even perform better than them. And we are going to have a discussion right on the central topic of this summit, which is how can we define growth strategy in the context of climate change, and thus the need for a really sustainable growth and sustainable future in a conjuncture following COP26 that we know now that is sustainable is not just a theoretical issue, it is a question of survival. So my first question is exactly this one. Is it possible to combine green transition with increased growth in the global economy, given all the environmental concerns and the costs associated with dealing with the impending climate disaster? Doesn't this particular change that is underway put limits to growth? To remember the Club of Rome report from 50 years ago, of course that was about energy and resources, but doesn't the change that is underway sort of puts actual limits to growth if we think changes in consumption patterns, changes in transport patterns, extra decentralization of production? Or is it possible to still have growth along with green transition?
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here. It would have been even nicer to be physically there, but it's still a pleasure to participate in the conference online. And to come straight to your question, if you look at the historical pattern of emissions, you see that emissions have been rising essentially since the start of industrialization and continue to rise. And we have had 26 COP summits behind us, but greenhouse gas emissions continue to rise. One year where they have fallen is basically last year during the pandemic. We've seen a significant fall of emissions, but global emissions overall are on an upward trend. Now, the second, I think, important statistic one has to look at is how many emissions do we need to produce 1 unit of output, 1 unit of GDP, 1 unit of consumption, as you put it. And if you look at that number, you see that actually every year we need a little bit less emissions to produce 1 unit of GDP. So there is some decoupling between GDP growth, consumption growth, and emissions. But the decoupling is way too slow because global emissions still increase. So the real question is, can this decoupling between GDP growth on the one hand and emissions, can that decoupling be done more quickly? And so quickly that basically we are able to decarbonize our economic system in the next 30 years, or even less than 30 years. We want to move to net zero. Science tells us that we need to move to net zero at the latest by 2050 in order to achieve the climate goal of 1.5 degrees Celsius. So we did some calculations on what it would take to really get there. And the reality is it will require a huge effort and a huge acceleration of the decoupling process. I mean, currently, just to throw at you some numbers, currently every year we need 1.6, 1.7% less emissions per unit of GDP. But global growth is at 3.5%, so that's why global emissions increase. Now, we basically need to move from 1.6% less emissions per unit of GDP to something like 9% less emissions per unit of GDP. So basically, a 6 times quicker decoupling than the one we see currently. And that 6 times, means massive investments. And the question is, how likely are those investments? How likely, how economically feasible are they? And will they be done from a political point of view? But one thing is clear, if we just continue more or less with business as usual, we will fail with the climate goals, that's for sure. So massive investments are needed. And I can talk about what kind of investments and whether that's actually a feasible proposition at that stage, I guess, in the second question.
Well, yes. This is the second question because in a certain way, one can easily think that moving towards net zero actually requires very big, a massive investment. And by itself, which is a very material investment, it's building solar parks and wind farms and changing infrastructure and mass producing electric cars, etc., and batteries. This sounds indeed like an engine for growth. But on the other hand, when we have reached the goal of green transition, the changes in the infrastructure, there is still the open question whether we are still within the same growth dynamics, at least in their material aspects. And one might say, yes, but one way or the other, we're moving towards a more service-oriented economy or less tangibly material. But still, this opens up the question where is there a degrowth future ahead of us?
Well, let me start with a note of optimism to answer that question. And the note of optimism comes really from the fact that electricity production can now be done very cheaply with renewable energy. In fact, the price for solar and wind energy has fallen by around 90% in the last decade, 90%. And if you take the unsubsidized price of electricity generated by wind or sun, you will see that it's actually, the unsubsidized price is actually by now cheaper than electricity generated by coal and gas and oil. So there is some reason for hope that this actually starts to become an affordable avenue. Let me, however, also say that there are important sectors where this decarbonization is still actually quite expensive, and where the technology does not yet exist. So we need to invest at the moment also a lot into technologies, into the development of technologies, so that it becomes actually affordable to decarbonize. Now, I think your question then is, suppose the world, or let's start with the European Union. The European Union wants to decrease its emissions by 55%, as it's currently the goal until 2030. How much will that change the growth model? Will it actually affect the growth model? And I would say there the answer is we don't know. There's actually quite a bit of uncertainty in the literature about how much of a negative effect on growth will massive climate action have. My view is if we spread this and don't immediately have massive, force massive changes in the energy system, we can probably cope with the decarbonization without a major deceleration of growth. But it requires very careful handling and I think a thoughtful, really quite a cautious approach, but it can't be too cautious because then we don't decarbonize. So policymakers are actually in a very difficult spot, but I would warn the European institutions against sort of declaring easy victory. I mean, there is some communication out there saying, well, the European Green Deal is Europe's growth strategy. Well, that's not so clear. It might well be leading to a period of the same or possibly even somewhat less growth.
And since we're talking about Europe, I mean, let's see how this massive infrastructure spending is dealt with. I mean, during the pandemic, especially in Europe, we saw a very big increase in public expenditure in regards to avoiding the pandemic, the health crisis turning into a social and economic crisis. And many have suggested that this is exactly the kind of action that we need in order to deal with climate change. That is a kind of coordinated and even centralized European massive infrastructure spending program. As far as I remember, you have opposed or have been slightly critical of any idea of using the same approach, something similar to Next Generation EU to deal with spending for climate change infrastructure. Am I right?
Well, let me try to explain the issue and then come to answering your question. I mean, the issue is the following: the European Commission, the European institutions, estimate that annual investments in the energy and transport system have to increase by 360 billion per year. So the annual investments by 360 billion. Now that's a lot of money. That's roughly 2% of EU 27 GDP. An important question is how much of that 360 billion needs to be funded with public money. If you take current investments into the energy and transport system, on average, roughly a quarter is funded by the public sector. So this gives you something like 80, 90 or 100 billion per year in additional public investments into climate. Now, no matter what kind of fiscal rules we have, a fiscal consolidation period is ahead of us in all of Europe. Why is that? Well, basically because we are hopefully getting out of a pandemic. There's a recovery. And during the pandemic, governments have given extraordinary fiscal support to the economy. And that fiscal support at some stage will have to end. We cannot keep deficits at 8, 9, 10% as we did in 2020. So there is a fiscal consolidation period. And the problem is in a fiscal consolidation period that typically the first victim of fiscal consolidation is public investment. So the question is, how do we keep up public investment or even increase public investment in green infrastructure in a period of fiscal consolidation? I personally think the best approach is something like a green golden rule. So basically allowing these green investments to be funded with public deficits without counting them in the fiscal consolidation efforts according to the European fiscal rules. That would allow this funding to actually be, this investment to be done without major political costs that otherwise would have, because otherwise basically the increase in the green investment would have to be funded by cuts elsewhere, such as cuts in social entitlement programs. So that's for me, I think the logical solution. Now we have a European program which is called Next Generation EU. It is being used for excuse me. It is being used for the next 3-4 years. But after that, what kind of justification can you give for a significant transfer of resources to countries elsewhere in the Union? I mean, why would taxpayers in some countries pay for the green transition in other countries? I think that the Next Generation EU program was so powerful and was feasible because of the extraordinary health situation. But will the climate situation justify similar amounts of transfers? I very much doubt that this is politically feasible.
Well, one might say that exactly climate change is the kind of a cross-border global challenge, one that should be in the end based on solidarity. But I mean, don't you think that if we, instead of a more general relaxation of fiscal rules, if we go into your idea of a green kind of golden fiscal rule, excluding only climate change investment, wouldn't this lead to a kind of endless, EU debate, negotiation, and occasional conflict on how to define what is considered indeed green investment or not? Or in this sense, wouldn't a more general relaxation of rules be better?
Well, I mean, just to answer the global point, the externality point, I mean, you're right that climate change is a global phenomenon and therefore requires global collaboration. And, I have a certain sympathy for international climate finance. And this is, as you know, part of the COP program. So the idea to support the poorest countries in the world with climate mitigation and adaptation is, I think, quite well established. And there is some funding there. And probably the return of that funding in terms of actually reducing emissions is very high, because a lot of very inefficient technologies can be, coal-fired power plants can be switched off if funding was made available. So in that sense, the global collaboration point, I would say, is a fair one. I think it's less strong within the EU actually than globally. And when it comes to the rules, I think you're right. There is a very important challenge of defining what is green investment. We need a clear taxonomy, and we need an institution that supervises that and does so in a very strict way.
Yes, okay, let's hope that in this case the EU defies its reputation and manages to actually find common ground. I wish we had more time. It's always a pleasure to listen to you, combining both analysis and always an approach based on hard data and factual reality. I would like again to thank you for being with us, and let's hope that indeed all this global debate ends up indeed at a sustainable future. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.